For decades, Americans have been taught that the three branches of government are equal: the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. But recently, an House Speaker made a bold claim: we do have authority over the federal courts. That single line has set off a firestorm in Washington. So here's the big question: does Congress really have authority over the courts? Or is Johnson overstepping into dangerous territory? This isn't just a theoretical debate. It strikes at the very heart of how American democracy works. The principle of separation of powers is supposed to keep each branch in check, preventing any one of them from becoming too powerful. If Johnson is right, it could mean Congress has tools to rein in what many conservatives see as an activist judiciary. But if he is wrong, or if this authority is pushed too far, it risks undermining the very independence of the courts that protect our constitutional rights. And make no mistake, this argument isn't happening in a vacuum. It's unfolding in the lead-up to the 2024 elections. Battles over abortion, gun rights, executive power, and even election integrity will all be fought, not just in Congress, but in the courts. In this video, we'll break down the history, the constitutional framework, and the political stakes. We'll explore what Congress can and cannot do, past clashes between lawmakers and judges, and what Johnson's claim could mean for the future of American democracy. Constitutional framework: who controls what? To really understand Johnson's claim, we need to go back to the Constitution itself. Article 3 lays out the foundation of the federal judiciary. But here's the interesting part: it's surprisingly vague. Unlike Congress and the presidency, which have long, detailed sections in the Constitution, the judiciary gets just a handful of lines. The Supreme Court is mentioned by name, but all other federal courts? Those are left for Congress to decide. And that's exactly what Congress has done for more than 2 centuries. It created the system of district courts and appeals courts we use today. It sets the number of judges, outlines the rules of jurisdiction, and even determines how much judges get paid. Congress also holds one of the most serious checks of all: impeachment. While rare, it is technically possible for Congress to remove federal judges, including Supreme Court justices, if they commit high crimes and misdemeanors. But the founders didn't want the courts to be political puppets. That's why they built in safeguards. Judges are appointed for life, not subject to re-election or political cycles. Their salaries can't be cut as punishment. And ever since Marbury versus Madison in 1803, the judiciary has claimed the power of judicial review, the authority to strike down laws it deems unconstitutional. What this creates is a deliberate tension. Congress can shape, fund, and even limit the courts, but the courts can turn around and block congressional laws. Neither side has absolute power. That balance of authority and the conflict it inevitably produces was baked into the system by design. The founders wanted friction, believing it was the best way to prevent tyranny by any single branch of government. Historical precedents of congressional power over courts. Johnson's statement might sound shocking today, but history shows that Congress has flexed its muscle over the judiciary many times before. Let's start at the very beginning. In 1789, Congress passed the Judiciary Act, creating the first system of federal courts. Without that law, there would be no lower federal courts at all. Just over a decade later, politics got heated. In 1802, President Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans clashed with the Federalist-controlled judiciary. Jefferson's allies in Congress went so far as to cancel a term of the Supreme Court, effectively pausing its operations to prevent it from blocking their agenda. It was a bold move that demonstrated just how much control lawmakers could exert. Another major example came during Reconstruction. In the case of Ex parte McCardle, 1869, Congress literally stripped the Supreme Court of jurisdiction over certain appeals related to Reconstruction policies. And the court, rather than risk a constitutional showdown, backed down. It was a striking reminder that Congress can, under the Constitution, decide what kinds of cases the federal courts can and cannot hear. Fast forward to the 1930s. President Franklin Roosevelt, frustrated with conservative justices striking down parts of the New Deal, proposed adding more seats to the Supreme Court, a so-called court-packing plan. While the plan failed politically, it signaled the immense pressure Congress and the presidency can put on the judiciary when they feel blocked. Even the size of the Supreme Court itself has not always been 9. Over the years, Congress has changed that number several times. from as few as 6 justices to as many as 10. It was only in 1869 that the number was fixed at 9, where it remains today. The lesson is clear. Congress does have authority to shape and challenge the judiciary. But history also shows that whenever lawmakers push too far, political backlash is almost inevitable. Johnson's conservative argument. So why is Speaker Mike Johnson making this claim now? To understand, we need to look at the conservative legal movement over the past half-century. Many conservatives argue that the courts have too often acted like legislators, inventing rights or striking down laws based on personal ideology rather than strict constitutional interpretation. Take abortion, for example. For decades, conservatives viewed Roe v. Wade as the ultimate example of judicial overreach, judges creating a national right to abortion that wasn't explicitly written in the Constitution. Even though Dobbs v. Jackson in 2022 overturned Roe, the battle reinforced conservative skepticism about judicial power. There are other flashpoints too. Gun rights cases, election disputes in 2000 and 2020, and rulings on executive power have all fed into the belief that courts wield enormous political influence. Johnson's statement channels that frustration, presenting Congress as the rightful counterbalance to what he and others see as activist judges. This argument also reflects the rise of movements like the Federalist Society, which have pushed for originalism, the idea that the Constitution should be interpreted based on its original meaning at the time it was written. For conservatives like Johnson, reasserting congressional authority isn't about destroying the courts, but about restoring what they see as the proper balance of power. In other words, Johnson's claim resonates with a long-standing conservative narrative that unelected judges shouldn't have the final say over laws passed by democratically elected representatives. Limits of congressional power. But before Congress rushes in to flex its authority, it's important to remember there are serious limits to what lawmakers can actually do. First, Congress cannot simply fire judges it doesn't like. The only way to remove a federal judge is through impeachment and conviction, a process so rare that it's happened only a handful of times in U.S. history. Second, the courts themselves have the power of judicial review. Since Marbury v. Madison in 1803, the Supreme Court has claimed the authority to strike down laws passed by Congress if they violate the Constitution. That means any aggressive attempt by lawmakers to curtail the judiciary could easily end up being blocked by the judiciary itself. Third, judicial independence isn't just a constitutional principle, it's a public expectation. Americans may disagree on rulings, but the idea that judges are not beholden to political leaders is one of the cornerstones of democratic legitimacy. If Congress is perceived as trying to politicize or control the courts, it risks eroding public trust in the entire system. Finally, even jurisdiction stripping, one of Congress's most powerful tools, is fraught with political risk. While technically constitutional, it could spark a constitutional crisis if overused. The Supreme Court has, at times, signaled it would resist jurisdictional attacks that undermine its core role. In short, Johnson isn't wrong to say Congress has authority, but that authority is limited, conditional, and comes with enormous political consequences. Modern flashpoints between Congress and courts. If all of this feels abstract, let's bring it into the modern era. In recent decades, some of the biggest political battles have unfolded not in Congress, but in the courts, with lawmakers watching in frustration as judges made final rulings. Take Obamacare. Passed in 2010, the Affordable Care Act immediately faced lawsuits claiming it was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court weighed in multiple times, upholding key parts of the law but also striking down others. For Democrats in Congress, it was maddening to see their signature achievement repeatedly dragged into court. For Republicans, it reinforced the idea that judges were standing in the way of a full repeal. Then came the Trump years. His travel ban targeting several Muslim-majority countries was blocked and modified repeatedly by federal courts before eventually being upheld in a narrower form. Lawsuits over immigration, environmental regulations, and the 2020 election kept the judiciary front and center. Every time Congress passed, or failed to pass, laws, the courts ended up being the battlefield. Under President Biden, the trend has only accelerated. His plan to forgive billions in student loan debt was struck down by the Supreme Court, despite being a major policy promise. Other administration actions on climate change, workplace safety, and immigration have faced legal challenges with mixed results. What all of these flashpoints show is that Congress often feels sidelined. Lawmakers write and pass laws, but the courts get the final say on whether those laws stand. That dynamic creates enormous frustration, and it's why leaders like Mike Johnson are arguing that Congress needs to reassert its constitutional authority over the judiciary. But history also shows, every time lawmakers push too hard against the courts, they risk sparking a backlash that could weaken their cause instead of strengthening it. Political dimensions of Johnson's statement. So why did Mike Johnson make this statement now? Timing is everything in politics. As Speaker of the House, Johnson knows his words are not just about legal theory. They're about energizing a political base. By declaring that Congress has authority over the federal courts, he's signaling defiance, a kind of pushback against what conservatives see as judicial interference. This fits neatly into the broader Republican narrative. For years, Republicans have argued that unelected judges have blocked legislation on everything from abortion restrictions to immigration reforms. By highlighting congressional power, Johnson is telling voters something: that conservatives won't just complain about activist judges. They'll take action to rein them in. Democrats, of course, see it very differently. To them, Johnson's rhetoric sounds like a warning sign of authoritarian overreach. They argue that undermining judicial independence is the first step toward dismantling the rule of law. They often point to countries like Poland or Hungary as cautionary tales, where governments tighten control over the judiciary. The media has jumped on the clash of narratives, framing the debate as Johnson versus separation of powers. Headlines highlight the tension between Congress and the courts, asking whether Johnson's comments are bold realism or a dangerous stunt. And make no mistake, the politics go beyond the present moment. With 2024 elections approaching, judicial authority is becoming a wedge issue. Abortion rights, election disputes, and gun laws will all wind their way through the courts. For Johnson and Republicans, making Congress appear powerful reassures voters. For Democrats, defending judicial independence is a warning against creeping authoritarianism. Either way, Johnson's statement keeps the battle over the courts front and center. Scholarly and legal expert opinions. When you ask legal experts about Johnson's claim, answers differ. Some scholars agree that Congress holds significant authority. They point to history as proof. Congress created the lower courts. It sets jurisdiction and can even change the size of the Supreme Court. One conservative scholar put it bluntly: Congress absolutely sets jurisdiction. If lawmakers want to limit cases, that's constitutional authority. But other experts are far more cautious. Liberal and centrist scholars warn that rhetoric like Johnson's is dangerous. They argue it risks undermining judicial independence, which is essential to a functioning democracy. As one legal expert noted, Congress can shape courts, yes, but declaring political dominance risks erasing separation of powers. This split reflects deeper philosophical differences. Conservatives emphasize accountability and democratic legitimacy. Elected representatives, not unelected judges, should have the final say. Liberals emphasize checks and balances. Courts must be shielded from politics to protect rights and limits. In short, the academic debate mirrors the political one. Johnson may not be factually wrong, but the implications of his words depend on perspective. The risks of congressional overreach. Even if Johnson is correct about congressional authority, risks remain. The biggest danger is erosion of judicial independence. If courts become too beholden to political majorities, they lose neutrality. They risk becoming extensions of whichever party holds power. That's a slippery slope toward politicized justice. Another risk is retaliation. If Republicans reshape the judiciary, Democrats could do the same later. The cycle of payback could spiral, weakening the courts permanently. There's also the question of public trust. Confidence in the Supreme Court is already near record lows. Polarizing decisions on abortion and voting rights fuel distrust. If Congress is seen as trying to punish courts, trust could collapse further. International examples show the risks clearly. Hungary and Poland used jurisdiction changes and court packing. The result was democratic backsliding and global criticism. Critics fear the U.S. could risk credibility abroad as a democracy defender. Future outlook. Can Johnson actually do this? So, can Mike Johnson deliver on his claim? In theory, yes. Congress does have tools to shape and restrain the judiciary. But in practice, it's far more complicated. Any major move would need approval from both chambers. It would also need a presidential signature or a veto override. With divided government, sweeping changes are unlikely. Even with unified control, public scrutiny and lawsuits would follow. Still, reform ideas are already being debated. Progressives talk about expanding the Supreme Court. Conservatives discuss jurisdiction stripping on cultural issues. Others float term limits for justices. But most proposals face steep hurdles. Court expansion is unpopular with voters. Jurisdiction stripping risks a constitutional crisis. Term limits likely need an amendment. What's more realistic is an ongoing tug-of-war. Johnson's claim is less a blueprint and more a signal. A warning shot that Congress won't sit by silently. The long-term implication is clear. The struggle between Congress and the courts is intensifying. At the end of the day, Johnson's claim isn't entirely wrong. History shows Congress has shaped the judiciary many times before. But authority doesn't equal dominance. The founders designed checks so no branch could control the others. That's the tension at the heart of American democracy. Congress may pass laws, but the courts test them against the Constitution. And while Congress can shape the judiciary, power is limited. The real significance of Johnson's claim is political. It marks fault lines heading into 2024. For Republicans, it's about reclaiming authority from activist judges. For Democrats, it's about protecting judicial independence. And here's the takeaway. This isn't just a battle between lawmakers and judges. Ultimately, it's a battle that plays out in the voting booth. Because the authority to shape the courts flows back to the people. Closing punch. In the end, the real authority over the courts isn't just in Washington. It's in the hands of the American people who decide who tests the limits of power.